is just gonna be a conversation between the two of us, and I just have to read this first part and then we'll get going. My name is Morgan Young. I am interviewing Mike Thorne for the Oregon State Capitol Foundation Oral History Project. It is June 25th, 2025, and we are in Pendleton, Oregon. So I want to start in the beginning, and I want to start with you telling me a bit about growing up in Pendleton and how long your family has been in this area.
Well, yes, my grandfather actually homesteaded about 20 miles from Pendleton in the late 1800s, and he was a farmer, rancher, quite a horseman, and from there our family simply grew and expanded, and we have been here ever since. Some of the interesting things about the Thorne family, it was known in the area and known quite well in the area. People knew the Thorne family who lived in a small community northwest of Pendleton. So throughout the years, we became more integrated into the expanded community of Pendleton. But it all began with my grandfather homesteading in rural Oregon.
What was his first name?
His first name was Roy. His full name was Leroy Stevens Thorne. He came from the Dakotas, and it's interesting, a lot of the history of people that migrated during the Homestead Act was a byproduct of a lot of hard economic times, and you track the movements, why they basically resulted as a result of drought or hardship or whatever. And so from some of the really difficult times in the Dakotas, my grandfather came west.
And you grew up in an agricultural family?
Yes, my dad farmed with my grandfather when he was out of high school, and then I took over management of the farm. Our family has been involved in the farming operation. We now have no grandsons, so the farm has taken on a completely different shape with our granddaughters, 3 that are not interested. However, my son and our daughter Katie, my son Todd, and our family still maintain active participation in what we're doing at the farm today.
So you were born and raised in the area and went to high school in the area?
Yes, went to Pendleton High School. Actually, where we were living when I was born and raised, we actually would have gone to the Helix School District. However, there was a rural grade school in a little town called Holman, and that school had just closed when it was time for me to go to first grade. So some of the farm families in that area actually purchased a Ford utility van. This was back in the late 40s, and they had a person, a wife of one of the hands that worked for some of us out in the farm, drove a school bus then and brought a group of us to school in Pendleton. So we actually started going to school in Pendleton as a result of a grade school that closed in a little town called Holman. From that time on, of course, always went to Pendleton School in the Pendleton school system and graduated from Pendleton High School.
And then you went to Washington State?
Yes. When I graduated, the question was where to go. I was fortunate enough to be the first member of our family to be able to attend college, and the decision was between Oregon State and Washington State finally. And quite honestly, the agricultural production, the agricultural interests that I had were more reflected at the programs at Washington State, so that's why I went to school there.
And what was your degree in?
I graduated in agriculture. I took quite a few ag business courses, and I also took quite a few agricultural technology type courses. So it was a degree in agriculture.
And then you met an important person when you were there?
Well, yes. When about halfway through my time at Washington State, I actually joined a fraternity my second semester, and across the street from our fraternity, which was an agricultural fraternity, Alpha Gamma Rho, a young woman was Pi-Phi, and I was attracted by her participation playing touch football with one of the other fraternities, and decided that, you know, that's someone I'd like to meet. Finally did, through a lot of help from some of my friends. I think the first take was she didn't really have any interest, but I was able to persuade her via association with some of my friends and her friends. And from that time, it was a relationship like a lot of college relationships. Didn't think it was going to last, didn't think it would go anyplace, but ultimately it wound up in us getting married.
So then did you come back to the family farm after college?
Yes. When I graduated from college, of course, my family, I think, were all anxious for me to get away from school and get back here and go to work, do something that was productive. And so, yes, we returned back to Pendleton, lived in a small house on the farm, very small. Actually, shortly after we returned, we had our first child, our daughter Katie, so it was a pretty abrupt change from college life to returning to the farm, where I was working very long hours in the summer, and we were, starting a family. And that life became pretty dominant for us for the first few years. I mean, I was working long hours, and Jill hung in there with the early part of our family life, which eventually, I think, led to her wise decision that caused me to take on other activities in life.
Well, tell me how you first got involved in politics and...
Well, yes. It so happened that when Jill was at college, she had an interest in government and political science, and actually had been to some campus events and met John Kennedy. And so when we returned to the farm, that interest was still something she had. It was not anything that I particularly had interest in. But as I had mentioned early on my return, I became responsible for managing the farm. And a lot of that work involved interface with the agricultural regulatory agencies, what's now called the Farm Service Center. But it was a place where farm programs were managed, what you could plant, what you couldn't plant, and a lot of the regulatory stuff. And I recall coming home from some of those sessions and being frustrated by, what seemed to be big government. And Jill's comments finally were, quit complaining. If you don't like the way it is, do something about it. And those words sort of set a new tone for our life. We became somewhat active in some of the local Democratic Central Committee activity. I was a registered Democrat primarily because that's what my parents were. It was not something that was a conscious decision. It was more a reflection of where we'd come from. And so that kind of started the ball rolling, going to some of those Central Committee meetings.
So talk to me about this decision in 1972 to run for the Oregon Senate, and you had not held elected office before.
Yes. Well, the district today, and it was back then, was basically a Republican district, although the Democratic Party was close to, in registration, to the Republicans. In fact, in some precincts, there were actually more. However, a farmer, neighbor, someone we all knew, by the name of Raymond. His name was Royal Raymond. They nicknamed him Rough Raymond. He decided to retire, so he wasn't going to run again. And of course, the Republican Party had a candidate selected to run, and there were 2 or 3 Democrats that were interested in running. I was not really interested, but Jill and some others, to their credit, kept pushing me. And finally, on the 11th hour, in the last minute, took my application to Salem. I didn't go, and I made the filing deadline to run for the state senate for District 29 as a Democrat in the primary.
You mentioned when we were chatting before that someone flew your application over?
Yes. By the time I finally agreed to sign it, there was not time to drive it to Salem. So this person took an airplane and got it to Salem, I believe, by 4:30 or so, prior to the 5 o'clock filing deadline. And I had not been in the Capitol prior to that time. In fact, my first trip to the state capitol was after I was elected in the fall election.
Wow. Well, I want to go back to your first impressions of the Capitol, but tell me a little bit about your first campaign. How was Jill involved? Were your kids involved? They would have been pretty young, I'm
Yes.
guessing.
Actually, I have to say that for sure the major reason I was elected was the organization skills that Jill had. She did a phenomenal job, and it was a result of a book she had read and her interest in political science. And she actually organized our campaign on a precinct-to-precinct basis. So we knew going into the election just about wherever precinct would vote. And so our children were a part of our door-to-door campaign. They would get in the car after school with Jill and go pass out brochures. It was a very subtle but highly organized campaign that she is responsible for putting together. And much to most people's surprise, we won. And from there, then it became more my responsibility to do something after we had been successful in the campaign.
So then you start your first term in the Oregon Senate in 1973.
That's correct.
And what are your first impressions of the building when you walked into the Capitol?
There's nothing that just strikes me like, awestruck. I do remember my first evening. There was an orientation session, and there were 3 lobbyists who introduced themselves to me, and we went out to dinner. And of course, this was all new stuff. This was completely new to me. But one of them was Hank Crawford, who is no longer living. Another one was Vern Pearson, who is no longer living. And the third one was Bob Knipe. None of them are alive today. But I'll never forget the words that they told me. They said, "Thorne, you're new to this process, but if you come here thinking that this is all about you, you've made a mistake, a serious mistake. This is about what you can do for the people you represent, and when you leave here, if you leave with your reputation intact and your honesty and your ethics still at a high standard, you will have been successful." Those words I'll never forget. They set the tone of how I felt we should function and participate in the Oregon legislature. Much to my chagrin today, I don't think that principle is followed, and it's disappointing to observe what appears to be a situation where money and political influence is controlling the people that are participating. But the first words that I remember in my first experience probably was the most important words of advice I ever had as I entered the political world.
Tell me a bit about the people you were representing in District 29.
Well, 29 clearly is a natural resource-based district, agriculture, timber, wood products. And there were also Pendleton in particular was a medical community at the time, and it was kind of a legal center. Now that's altered somewhat. But basically, the economy was a local economy. Downtown was a place for, you went for supplies rather than going to Amazon or wherever you go today. And so it was a very close-knit rural community that depended heavily upon the activity of the resource-based economy. So my participation in Salem was my activities were heavily dictated by the district I represented. And I felt that my job was to represent the district, not the party. And so I paid very close attention to what was going on locally in my district.
And your district also included a reservation with the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla?
Yes, it did. It's interesting, over time, the Umatilla tribes have changed dramatically. When I first went to the legislature, there were some preliminary pieces of legislation. In fact, I was involved in one that was beginning to establish some of the separate jurisdictions. I think one of them had to do with the legal process, law enforcement. All of this was in the early stages, and I believe I introduced a bill early on. However, the bill probably went too far, and we didn't understand the intent as clearly as we should in trying to coordinate and make sure that the local governments and the tribal governments or government understood how this was intended to work. That was held up, but later on, all of that has changed. Much of it was as a result of the federal government participation, to the point today where the tribe has managed to reacquire a lot of the land that they had sold, land that had been leased, land that they, maybe in some cases, properties that they didn't own but have purchased, to the point that the tribe today is a very successful business center. People are exceedingly productive, and the resource-based economy that they have is very, very active. They're now building a new, or plan to build a new, $100 million hotel at their casino. So the tribe has become a very critical and very important economic part of this community today.
Sorry to interrupt, Morgan, really quick. I'm catching just like a little bit of the paper in the corner of my screen. And then also, I don't know if you want to still hold the tissue that you have.
Oh, yeah. Let me just put it in my pocket, okay? Or I'll just lay it over here. There.
Yeah, it's just the floor, actually. So. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
You and your family needed to move to Salem then, at least during the week when the legislature was in session?
Yes, we did. In fact, our family was very young. They were in grade school the first session, and so we basically moved to Salem. What we thought, I'll never forget loading boxes of clothes and supplies, and off to Salem we went. And our first session, our son and daughter, Katie and Todd, went to school in Salem. As the years passed, of course, and they became more active in school here in Pendleton, it wasn't fair to them to split the school year, we felt, and so they stayed in Pendleton in part with my parents, and then later Jill spent more time here as they became more active in junior high school and high school. But first session, we all moved to Salem, and in fact, I'll never forget loading boxes of stuff in the back of the pickup truck, and we thought we were going to another land almost.
Well, it's quite different
Yes.
from where you had been. That first session you had, what an iconic session to be a participant in.
Yeah.
You know, the passage of Senate Bill 100, I'd love for you to tell me about that. Senate Bill 101. There were
Yeah.
also 11 pieces of feminist legislation. I think it was the most number at the time of women serving in the legislature.
Yes. Well, you know, I think it's fair to kind of cast a bit the enthusiasm that started to develop, and it kind of began to show its face in the legislature in the early 70s. We actually had Robert Kennedy at our house when he was running for president in '68. And I think there was a feeling in the country, turmoil, unrest. There was a great interest in government, and so we went into a situation where people were motivated to do things rather than a situation where a special interest or a party or some other group was trying to achieve an outcome. So as a consequence, we had a lot of motivated people that wanted to do something, and they weren't split necessarily by party line. They just were motivated to make the right thing happen. And so some of the activities, you mentioned Senate Bill 100, the historic land use planning bill in Oregon. It actually passed. I had the pleasure of serving on the committee that wrote the bill. And sometimes today people will ask about it or wonder about how a piece of legislation that regulated farm use and farmland production could have been accepted by the rural community. I mean, doesn't have regulatory implications to it? And yes, it does. And one of the pieces of legislation that passed with Senate Bill 100 was Senate Bill 101. And that piece of legislation set up a different taxation formula for farmland that was in zone farm use. It taxed property for farm use based on its production rather than on its market value or the sales value of the property. That was the key to maintaining the support for people that were in agriculture and in rural production, crops, whether livestock or whatever, to find favor and support the bill. So many people today, I think, forget the fact that if you want to do something and you want to have it embraced, such as Senate Bill 100 was and is, you have to do more than just set up the regulatory framework. You've got to find a way to cause people to be interested and incentivized to participate. Senate Bill 100 set up the regulation. 101 set up the incentive base by changing the tax structure, which was to this day been beneficial to maintain agricultural land in agricultural production in Oregon.
How did your background in agriculture influence your work in the legislature?
I think people that spend their life in the agriculture world are people who have to understand how so many things work and how so many things happen and how so many things function. You know, a rancher or a farmer today, has to know how to take care of their cropland and their farm animals or whatever the case may be. But in many cases, they got to know how to run their tractor, fix the plow. Whatever the case is, they've got to learn how to be exceedingly diversified. And so much of that I would call is just the product of common sense and experience. And I was thinking about that in the light of where we are today. Maybe then we lived in the world of common sense and applied intelligence. And today we're in the world of artificial intelligence, where you go to Google, you ask a question, and you get an answer. That might be over-exaggerating, but I think it in part explains some of the differences that people in rural communities live with versus people maybe in other communities. Whatever we do, so much of the time you have to find a way to do it yourself, and so I would think that lifestyle and that experience helped me an awful lot in trying to analyze and think through what legislation would do, trying to set in place principles for how we should operate, set in place the way we should approach budgeting, financial management. It all came about as a result of experience rather than coming about as a result of someone telling, well, this is how you do it.
Tell me a bit about your committee work. I mean, you served on Ways and Means. I think you served on Agricultural and Natural Resources Committee.
Yes. I was first elected in '73, and I was chair of the Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee, and people were somewhat appalled that someone that had not even been in the Capitol is suddenly chairing the committee. But I don't think that really troubled me a whole lot. I'd had, as I said, experience in trying to find ways to solve problems, and I immediately turned to my committee. I had some very, very good committee members. Ted Halleck was on my committee, Tony Meeker. It was a cross-section of party, and everybody was there basically to want to make something happen that was, the right thing to do, if you will. So that committee actually was quite enjoyable, and many of those people that are still alive today are still good friends. Later on, though, in the Kitzhaber administration, I became chair of the Ways and Means Committee. And I think of all of my legislative service, the ability to manage the state's budgeting process and setting in place a process where the legislature had managerial control over the framework of the budget, which up until that time was not really the case, was probably, from my perspective, the most significant accomplishment that was able to make. We set up at the very beginning what was called the co-chair's budget. Before I released that budget, we spent numerous hours going through every budget that came. So I had a pretty good idea of what was in every budget, what the new additions were, what the priorities of the agencies were, the priorities of the governor. And then we were able to set up a framework where each subcommittee had flexibility within that framework on how they would ultimately adjust the final budget. So we knew about what we could spend, and we had a pretty good idea of what program additions were new and what were being discontinued, if you will, so that when we went through the process, we knew where we were going rather than trying to fumble our way through the changes that were coming from the governor's office or wherever.
And that's been your big legacy, was the setting up the budgetary.
Yeah, I think so. I look back, and yes, there was a lot of statutory legislation, but I think putting in place a process that put the legislature and the executive branch on a pretty even plane to establish the program for the state for the coming biennium was probably the most significant.
I want to talk a bit about work between the legislative and executive branches. So during your tenure in the legislature, the Democrats controlled both houses for all your terms?
Yes. In 71, the Senate was controlled by a coalition, a conservative Democrat Republican coalition. When I was then elected in 73, that changed, and the Democrats controlled the legislature, the Senate legislature, so from that time going forward. The majority, though, was very narrow, and especially in the Senate, it could go either way. There was no dominant party presence on any given vote. It could go left or right, if you want to put it in those terms. And I think, to a great extent, the best legislation comes when you have that kind of narrow perspective, and it forces people to really explain and understand what they're trying to do.
I'm just going to wait for the clock to stop. Sorry. No?
Can I get a sip of water,
Absolutely.
too?
since for oral history, you might want to do that question again.
Okay.
Should read it.
Okay, Jill, what did I say that's not right?
You're doing great. I might ask you to repeat your thoughts again, just so we have it clear without the clock chiming. But tell me again about the Democratic Party had just gained control of both houses by the time you came into the legislature, but they were close margins.
That's correct, yes.
Particularly in the Senate.
Yes, in fact, the Senate control, had I followed the previous posture where there was a coalition, we could have continued as a coalition. I was probably the one person that could have caused that to shift if John Burns, who was a coalition president prior to my coming, had chosen to follow that step. So it was that close. But I felt, even though I don't think the party really was that important to me, I felt that there should be a more responsible party control structure as opposed to the coalition, which was less defined in my mind. And so it was a judgment call at the time, and I believe it was the right call.
You mentioned at the beginning of our interview the impact of the wisdom shared by those lobbyists you met with.
Yes.
And so how did that, maybe you could close that circle of how that influenced how you voted on particular issues?
Well, I think most people that followed would agree with this. There were times when I wouldn't even go to a caucus meeting because I felt that what was being discussed was contrary to the principles that I felt that were important. I felt strongly that I needed to maintain contact with my constituency. I needed to understand what they were doing, what they needed, and what they wanted. And so I felt that representing them was more important than trying to do something that represented myself. I just think that stayed with me throughout this session. You know, today it's not uncommon, and I find it repulsive, where people are members of the legislature who have business relationships that they, as members of the legislature, can potentially influence, and they're being paid by that entity that potentially they can influence. That just violates all the fundamental principles that I ever believed you should follow. You know, I think that's one more value of the rural lifestyle. You know, they talk about my grandfather, for an example, some of the farmland that he farmed when he was first started. You know, where's the lease? Well, it was a handshake. And those principles, to me, still have great value. That was it. I'm not trying to put myself or paint myself as being above someone else. It's just was so ingrained in what I did that it just would be unnatural to do anything else.
When you started in the legislature, Tom McCall was governor.
Yes.
And I think, as a historian, he's an iconic Oregon governor, and there were some very exciting things that happened in Oregon state government under him. But talk to me a bit about the work between the legislative and executive branches, because you served under, I think, 5 governors over your 18 years in the Senate?
Yes. Yes. Well, first of all, you know, no two governors were the same. Tom McCall was clearly a byproduct of the media, so he understood very well how to communicate through the legislature and beyond. But he was very engaging. Tom McCall is an exceedingly engaging governor. Nowadays, the legislature is prohibited to some extent, from what I understand, from sitting down with the lobby and having dinner and talking through issues. I can recall evenings when at a local restaurant in Salem, Tom McCall would be at the head of the table, and there could be 10 or 15 legislators and others having dinner, and we'd be talking about things that needed to get done. And it was very positive and very productive. But McCall was probably the most outreaching governor in terms of that type of situation. Vicatia was more personal, hands-on, kind of work with people one-on-one. We knew him well. I served in the legislature with him. We've had him as guests at our home here in Oregon and Pendleton. Bob Straub was at our home in Pendleton. Goldschmidt, he probably was, of all of them, I think he probably was the most productive and creative. I mean, he loved to take on the tough stuff and fix it. I always think of him with workers' compensation, which was just a disaster in Oregon. And Goldschmidt was able to get the unions and the trial lawyers together and actually come up with a solution to workers' compensation that was, the business people today that knew it then will say it was almost impossible. They didn't think it could happen. So they were all different, but we tried to maintain a personal working relationship with them because obviously then the legislature and the governor's office, the executive, if you will, and the legislative branch had to work together. Today, I think that's a different structure, and I'm not sure quite how it works, but then it was a relationship that was needed to be healthy in order to produce good product.
What about working with Senate leadership over your time in the Senate?
I think it's a case where the relationship was a relationship of respect for position and a respect for people. The president of the Senate or the president of the caucus or the leader of the caucus was a position, but it was not a position to dominate thinking and to dominate other people's actions. I think today that may be more the situation where the president of the Senate and the Speaker of the House and co-chairs maybe tell people what to do. In my time, I didn't observe that type of relationship or that type of function. It was more a matter, okay, they are where they are, but we also are members of that group or members of the body, and it's our job to make sure that we stay on course for what's good for Oregonians and for good for individual people's constituency. So I think it was more of a productive, cooperative relationship rather than a dictatorial type relationship.
John Kitzhaber was Senate President
Yes.
during your tenure, and he was coming from a rural district, was
Yes.
he not, from the Roseburg area? What was your working relationship like with him?
We had I think, a very interesting and a good working relationship. See, John was also a doctor, a medical doctor, as we all know. And so here, I remember sitting beside John when we were talking about the Oregon Health Bill, and there were people coming to the legislature explaining how health care was so punitive to certain people, and they were using examples where people, couldn't get care and the devastation as a result of that. And John was the first to take the lead in developing the Oregon healthcare program. I remember sitting beside John at the table. It was actually at a Ways and Means Committee meeting, and when that session was over and John explained what he wanted to do, I immediately got the picture and agreed with him wholeheartedly, and we went ahead to do it. John and I had that kind of a relationship where, while it had a social aspect to it, I think there was such a mutual respect for what people did and thought and how they functioned in their particular districts made that relationship enjoyable. John has been asked, and it was reported to me, about why selecting me to chair Ways and Means Committee, and John would say, well, everybody comes to me wanting something. He said, but I know if I send them down to see Mike Thorne, he has the ability to tell them no. And so we had kind of a professional relationship as opposed to a purely social, political relationship.
Let's talk a little bit about some legislation that you were involved in. We mentioned Senate Bill 100 and 101. When we were chatting before, you mentioned there was a landmark legislation about pesticides.
Yes, yes.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Yes, this was back in '73 again. The federal government was beginning to look at the application of pesticides on farmland, and Tony Meeker, Republican, was on my committee, vice chair, and we had a discussion about what that might be and what that might mean for Oregon. And I asked Tony to create a little subcommittee and work out a piece of legislation that actually set Oregon up as the first state in the nation with its own program set up in a method in which it was easier to administrate locally, and kept the federal government from telling us how the program should be run. That's just an example of how I thought the parties worked together. Okay, so I'm a Democrat and he was a Republican. That didn't matter. We had a problem that we had to deal with. And so we went about setting up a program, being the first in the nation. That's just one example of, probably doesn't rise to the level of the bottle bill and Senate Bill 100, but within the community that we're working, it was critical, very important, and we were able to do it, cooperative rather than by some political force telling us what we had to do.
Were there other successes that stick out in your mind or accomplishments during your time in the
Another one, I chaired the Ag and Natural Resources Committee, and salmon on the Columbia River were a very important issue. There were people who wanted to ban gill netting, and I had the cooperation of a coastal legislator, Stan Outerkirk, who was also a Republican at the time on the committee, who then took that project on to help create an outcome where today that's not the issue it was then. People were upset about the fishers were upset that the gill netters were getting the fish, and I recall going to a town hall meeting in La Grande, and people were going to recall me because I, wouldn't ban gill netting, and as it turned out, we solved the problem. The problem kind of went away, and that's just another example of how a productive legislature can get things done rather than a politically motivated legislature that's perceived to be divisive. And I think that was kind of the hallmark of the way the legislatures operated back in those earlier years.
Were there some challenges that you recall from your time in the Senate?
I think there's always challenges, but so many of the challenges are human caused. However, I do remember midway through my term, one of the more difficult challenges we dealt with was the whole question of mental health care and the state's role in taking care of the mentally ill. And it was part of the Reagan administration's effort to downsize federal government activities to reduce cost and send out to the states responsibility for managing health care that led to the closure of the likes of the Eastern Oregon mental facility here in Pendleton. It's now a prison. And that was the case in other facilities in Oregon. There still is the Oregon State Hospital, but there were other facilities that were closed. I think that was probably one of the more challenging and difficult projects we were involved in, and in the end, the results that have come about or occurred since were just the concerns we had back in the mid-'80s. You took people out of mentally ill facilities that cared for them, out of facilities for the mentally ill that cared for them, and put them on streets under the assumption that the state was going to provide small 10-bed local care facilities. That never happened. And so now the people are living on the street. We have a tremendous homeless problem. Not all of it is a result of that, but a big portion of it is a result of a decision that was made starting at the federal level to downsize costs, move programs to the state. The state did not or was not able to pick it up and manage it accordingly, and I don't know if they could have. And now, here we are with a problem that everybody doesn't know what to do with. You know, you look through things that happened in your tenure, that might have been one of the most challenging and disappointing and disturbing developments that we had to deal with. And I think it's particularly so because we now see the byproduct, and we got a problem that what do we do with?
So you were in the Senate for 18 years, right? 3 terms?
Yes. Actually,
No.
it was
For
4, and then
years.
I left midterm to go to the Port of Portland.
So talk to me about that.
Well, yes. It was the beginning of the '91 session, and I was contacted actually by a representative from the Port of Portland asking if I might have any interest in moving over to run the Port of Portland. And thought about that a while and thought about what I thought the port could do, should do, particularly in light of my, rural connections, and ultimately decided that I would do that. So I resigned the Senate and became the executive director of the Port of Portland in February of that year, '91.
What did Jill think of this decision?
Oh, actually, I think she probably thought it was okay. Jill was active in her own project. She was the executive director of the Oregon Sesquicentennial Celebration, which was the 150th year of the celebration of the Oregon Trail. So if she had some specific thoughts, she kept them to herself, but I think mainly because she was so busy in the activities she had, and I think for both of us, it was seen as another step in a world that we never really contemplated. When you go back to when I started, I never would have dreamed that I would be in that position. I always figured I'd be on the ranch farming and so on. But I think it was seen as, this is an interesting opportunity, and we take advantage of it to see what we can do.
So when you were the executive director of the Port of Portland, now you're working with the legislature
That's true.
occasionally, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What was that experience like now being on a different side?
Well, it was not a real active relationship. There was, interesting enough, when I was in the legislature, I actually put together and passed a bill that would set up the Channel Deepening Fund, and we appropriated $1 to create the fund, and the fund was set up initially because Coos Bay was trying to get some dredging done in their channel. And later on, then, once they defined their scope, they came to the legislature, and some money was put into the fund to support their project. Well, it just so happened that a few years after this legislation passed, I'm at the Port of Portland, and I realized and I knew that fund was there, so we were able to tap into that and call upon our friends in the Ways and Means process to appropriate the funds so we could deepen the Columbia River Channel in a cost share program with the federal government to 40 feet. that was probably the most significant interface that we had. I think more of a point of interest when I was at the port. I also was involved in, and actually we put together the program to get light rail to the airport. But that didn't necessarily have direct relationship with the legislature, although clearly there were interests on the part of legislators, and particularly those from the metropolitan area on that. But the channel deepening was probably the biggest interface we had.
And I would imagine that your background in agriculture is coming into play directly at the Port of Portland.
Well, I think that was the reason that I saw the opportunity. As it turned out, the Port of Portland is critical for the movement of agricultural products from the inland Pacific Northwest. Wheat grown in Oregon, for an example, or particularly this part of the country, 80–90% of it's got to get on a ship and go someplace. It doesn't, it's not used domestically. So the Port of Portland, along with the rail system that fed the port and the barge system that served it on the river, was critical for the rural agricultural community. Not just grain, it was important for wood products and a whole multitude of other products that were, exporting products that were necessary for production, whether it's Idaho, Montana, that reach was part of what the port was able to serve.
I meant to ask you when we were talking about your career in the legislature, if you were continuing to operate the family farm during that time.
Yes, we did. I did. Obviously, it wasn't a day-to-day operation, but bear in mind, the hallmark of the Oregon legislature is supposed to be a citizen legislature. So it was intended to be a legislature where people kept doing what they normally did, but then took time out of their year or biannual legislature, it was 2 years, to serve in the legislature. That's obviously changed today and it's become annual sessions and so on, but the intent was you served the legislature not as the primary activity, but as a part of what you did in the rest of your life or the rest of your business or professional activity or whatever it was.
And then you bring that experience, right, as a citizen into the legislature.
That's right.
And so did you continue to be involved in operations of the farm while
Oh, yes.
at the port?
Yeah.
So then you were at the port for 10 years?
Yes.
And then from there?
Well, from there it was, I felt maybe it was time to come back, and both Jill and I still had an interest in Pendleton locally. We were here, and I think we both felt maybe it was time to come back and re-engage locally, and we did that, but. After a few months, a call came from Seattle from the people at the ferry system and wanted to know if I would consider going there and running the state ferry system. We ultimately did that. We were there for about 3 years. But I think we were at the point when I left the port that we felt it was really in our interest to come back here. And as a result of being back here and back home, we've had the opportunity to do several things in our local community. Jill has been deeply involved in urban renewal in downtown Pendleton. I've taken a pretty active interest in the Pendleton Roundup and the Happy Canyon, trying to improve facilities. So we continue to find ourselves, I think, exceedingly busy doing the things that we've always liked to do, but took a chunk of our life and did some other things. And I think as a consequence, maybe those experiences have been beneficial locally too.
Those are the questions I had. Jill, did you have questions or stories that? No?
Well.
I think you passed. I think that Are there any topics or stories that we didn't talk about that you want to make sure that we covered?
I don't.
One,
Yeah.
the land use planning that you served on in '73, they came back to you and you led the task force on
Oh.
it 2 years ago.
No, yeah.
So that they again used your historical references and how to do it. You might have something to say about that.
Well, I think what Jill is referring to, I can't remember how many years ago, was it Kulingoski's governorship? Might have been somewhere in that area. If today, the ongoing challenge of housing, that's real, and there will be people who will say that, Oregon's planning process is designed to try to force and encourage infill, and that's more expensive than if you could expand growth boundaries and just keep spreading and building. And that pressure led to the governor creating a task force. I chaired that task force. It didn't have anything really to do with the agricultural side, but the task force did, I think, try to encourage LCDC to find ways of dealing with what was a fundamental problem in the Land Use Planning Act. If you recall, LCDC was set up and counties and cities were instructed to create their own plan. They did that, and some communities created a very expansive plan. Other communities created a plan basically said, well, this is how big we are today. I don't see us changing much, and this will be our plan. And so Pendleton was an example of a community that had been pretty conservative. And as a result, there's been some legislative changes that we precipitated that has allowed them to get a little more expansion in their growth boundary. So yes, as a result of the planning process, and I actually had observed that early on, I was concerned that the planning was so localized that it didn't take advantage of statewide resources to try to focus on what growth might be and where it might be and what needed to be done to make sure that 50 years or 100 years from now we didn't paint ourselves into the box that some communities have. That was an effort to deal more with the housing side than necessarily the agricultural cropland side.
Are there other, I know that you're going to sit down with us and we're going to go through some clippings that you've saved, and I'm sure that there will be more history that you can share with us, but is there anything else that, while we're sitting down here or a bit more formally, that you want to make sure that we covered?
Well, I look back at the opportunity I had, what a great opportunity to serve in the legislature, and I look where we are today, and I am troubled by the fact that we have moved from a process that was designed to be inclusive and designed to try to serve a broader public interest to a process today that I think is more focused around money and influence, lobby, and special interests. And that serves not the greater public interest, but it serves a specific interest. And that is exceedingly troubling for me to observe it as I see it today.
How do we fix it?
Well, I suspect that, or at least I hope, let's go back to why did we get started? You know, we talked about the sort of the post-Kennedy era, and many young people, suddenly or finally kind of took a hold, and things started to happen and things started to change. The older community, the older folks aren't going to change it. So I guess if history has got any clue as to what we need to do in the future, it's going to depend upon us getting to the point where younger people say, I see where we're going, and it's not working. It's not going to work. We got to change it. I don't know if that interest is strong enough to drive the money issue. That's just unbelievably different than it was, when we ran our first primary for $900, and now that wouldn't even get you to the filing gate, I don't think. It's just appalling what's happening. So if there is a solution, it's obviously going to depend upon a group of younger people that have said enough is enough.
I think we're starting to see sparks of that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much for
Thank you.
sitting down with us today.
Okay, enjoyed it.